landowners and all of us who just have a little backyard can make our habitats more attractive to pollinators. And of course, we know there's a lot of birds that are pollinators and seed dispersers, so they're helped directly. It also helps the insects that the birds eat. Sorry about that, Sean. But all this ecosystem stuff starts with the soil and starts with the plants and so forth. So that's the base of our ecosystem. So Sean comes to us from everywhere, he says. He's lived all over the place, but he's interested in large-scale habitat restoration and conservation of rare and declining plants. We don't want to lose any of them. And he spent a decade studying pollinator conservation and ecology in the Midwest and the Eastern US, got his PhD from Michigan State. And then he said, thanks, I'll move to Texas. He's in Austin now, and we're so happy to have you tonight in person. Come on.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. So in my current role at the Wildflower Center, I spend most of my time working with plant people. So it's really nice being able to talk about bees and animals and people that appreciate them. So before I start, I was just wondering how many of you have been to the Wildflower Center? That's amazing. Okay, so for the very few of you that haven't been there, I really recommend visiting. It's a beautiful place. We're the State Botanic Garden of Texas. We also are part of the University of Texas. So we became one of the newest field stations of the university 2 years ago. So my role is working with scientists at the university. And we also have all native plants from across Texas at the Wildflower Center. And so just to show you a map real quick, let me see if this is too small, but hopefully you can see it. But we have all these gardens. We have about 9 acres of gardens. But what's really exciting to me as a scientist and conservationist is that the whole Wildflower Center is actually almost 300 acres. It's 284 acres. And so most of that, all the rest of this stuff is used for research and conservation. So we have some really massive experiments that have been there for, going on 2 decades. We have land where we can encourage other restoration people to come in. And we have a large amount of acreage that's actually just devoted to conservation, where we can put in rare plants and propagate them. So over the last few years, we've really been building up the science program. I've been there for about 2 years. And since then, when I started, that's really when it became a field station. So we've been able to grow our program really quickly. Our program has a number of different main focuses, but probably the biggest one is fire ecology. So understanding how we can use prescribed burns across Texas to improve the habitat. So we're somewhat unique in that we have a prescribed burn crew on site. We have a burn boss, and a majority of us, at least on the science team and horticulture and natural resources, are all fire trained. So we can go out and do these massive burns. We actually did one of 20 acres just a couple weeks ago in 120 heat index. We also have in our program, we're doing a lot of work looking at global change. So of course, climate change, increasing drought, especially here in Texas, and also land disturbance. So we just put in recently, we're still in the process of putting in this massive experiment as part of ecological monitoring networks, DragNet and DroughtNet, which are these international networks with about 300 members across the globe. And then finally, we do a lot of work with rare plant conservation. So we have a large seed bank with about 600 species banked, about 40 or 50 rare and endangered plants. And we're starting our work now with 2 especially rare plants, the big red sage, which actually grows in this area. We're very excited to start on that one. Actually, next week, we're going to go out and hopefully find some of these populations, and then also the Hinckley's oak, which is one of the rarest plants in the US and our only endangered oak that's found in West Texas in just one area. But we're here to talk about pollinators today. I just wanted to give you an overview of our program. So just to give you an idea of where I'm going with all this, I'm going to talk a bit about pollinators and pollination. I'll talk about threats to pollinators and pollinator conservation before getting into our research and what you all can do. Okay, so jumping right in, as you all know, nature provides all sorts of benefits for us, from food to water to recreation like fishing and hunting, and collectively these are known as ecosystem services. One of the most important to the functioning of our ecosystems and also to our agriculture is pollination. So the movement of pollen from one plant to another, which allows for plant reproduction. So this is done by animals. There are tons of different groups that do pollination. In some places, it's even done by things like lizards or rats. But you all probably know that the most important pollinators are the bees and flies. Collectively, pollination services or pollination animals mediate pollen movement for about 90% of flowering plants. And that's about 4,350 of the native Texas plants and about 75% of our global crop species, and contributes hundreds of billions to the global economy. So very important service, of course. And you all are familiar with honeybees. They're our most recognizable pollinators, but they are actually non-native. So they're social. They can have large colonies, up to 50,000 workers or more, but they actually originated in Europe. And you can think of them more as livestock. So they are livestock. So they have been in decline since about 2005, which has sparked a lot of discussion about saving the pollinators. And it's definitely harder to keep honeybees these days with all the disease. But largely their numbers are determined by market forces and beekeepers' efforts rather than habitat. So that brings us to the wild native bees. This is more what I study, but there are about 20,000 species of bees globally, and only 7 of those are honeybees. There are about 4,000 species in North America, and Texas is an incredible place to live for someone who likes bees because there's about 1,000 species here. The estimates range up to 1,200. And they come in all shapes and sizes. Sorry, I'll do this one. You know, there's green bees, large bees, small bees, lots of different morphological characteristics. But most of these bees are solitary, so actually don't have large colonies that you think of, and they thrive in really diverse habitats. Bees and other pollinators need a number of different resources. So as nature people, you all know this, but they're reliant on nectar and pollen from flowers as their main food source. But many pollinators are also reliant on vegetative parts of plants as food for larvae. But what a lot of people don't think about is that they also are reliant on shelter. So shelter is a really important resource for pollinators.
What are you doing?
And the more we learn about our
What are you doing?
the more we find actually shelter. So habitat for nesting may be the important determinant of populations in a lot of areas.
Come here.
So
What's the matter?
pollinators shelter in the ground. They make
What's the matter, Ray?
also cavities in wood, leaf litter, and on and in living vegetation, but the vast majority of bees live in nests in the ground. And in these nests, they rely on the shelter for managing temperature and protecting against changes in moisture levels, hiding from predators, and laying eggs. So I wanted to show this as an example of what we look at as a good pollinator habitat. So generally people just think about the wildflowers, and that is obviously incredibly important. But equally important is not just the number and abundance of these flowers, but also the diversity, and also the diversity of nesting habitats. So you don't necessarily just want a ton of forbs. For some species rely on grass, thatch to make their nests. Many bees rely on exposed soil, and then some rely on logs and trees. So you want a diversity of resources across the whole range. Okay, so that's the stuff that pollinators need. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the threats that they're facing. So you've all heard about this. Pollinators are declining. In some areas, there have been declines of up to 80% of insect biomass, and accompanied by huge declines in numbers of species. And bees are hit by a lot of these different factors. Disease, climate change has been found to be surprisingly impacting a lot of pollinators already, changing their ranges. Pesticides has gotten a lot of attention because of the honeybee crises, but the most important driver of these losses so far is habitat loss. Massive losses of their habitat across the United States. And so that's where a lot of our research focuses, is on correcting the habitat loss. This is due to things like urbanization. So this is a graphic over time from the 80s of urbanization around Dallas. Overgrazing in Texas also is a huge factor. Agricultural intensification, not as important for a lot of parts of Texas, but can be important in more like the Panhandle and up in the Northwest. And then resource exploitation, so clearing the ground. And so I'm always sad when I look at this figure, but prairie used to extend across North America. This shows the historic extent of tallgrass prairie, and estimates range all the way down to only 1% of that original prairie remaining. In Texas and through a lot of the United States, one of the biggest drivers of this habitat loss is actually the suppression of wildfires. This is where our fire ecology focus starts to come in. A lot of people are surprised about this, but in Texas, a number of studies have shown that fire would have historically happened extremely commonly. So less than every 10 years across the state. And in our area, in the Edwards Plateau, I've seen estimates that fire would have occurred every 0 to 6 years, or even every 0 to 3 years. And these are not the fires that you think of now that sweep through and jump between trees, because in areas that are burned repeatedly, there's less woody vegetation and the fires are not as intense because there's not as much biomass. So these would have been very small, patchy fires that would have happened all the time. They also would have historically been most common during the summer due to all the dry vegetation and lightning, especially at the end of the summer. But we in Texas and across the United States have suppressed this fire activity, leading to many more trees than would have historically occurred across the state. And also just buildup of more litter. that hasn't been consumed. So that's kind of the more depressing part, but now I'm going to talk about pollinator conservation and what we can do and what we are doing to correct some of these issues. So because there has been such a massive loss in habitat across the United States, it's not sufficient just to conserve what we have. We need to hold on to that remnant habitat, but we also need to create new habitat again. So one of the most important tools that we have in our tool belts as conservationists is restoration, which is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So turning something like a lawn or a field or an agricultural habitat back into a natural prairie. And this often involves seeding with native plants, which reinstates habitat structure, increases the abundance of flowers that pollinators can use as resources, and thus reintroduces this food and host plants back into the environment. It also involves bringing disturbances back to the landscape. So one of our most important tools is prescribed burning, which again is this disturbance that would have historically happened commonly, but has been suppressed. So that removes woody vegetation. It increases flowering by opening up space and also introducing nutrients to the ground. And it also creates bare ground as nesting habitat. So I just want to show this again because the combination of seeding and burning is thought to be critical to restore habitats back to this kind of ideal state. Okay, so that brings us to our research. So at the Wildflower Center, we have two main projects that focus on understanding how we can restore habitat for pollinators. The first is the Texas Pollinator Restoration Project. And the second is our long-term land management study. So I'm going to start with the Pollinator Restoration Project. And this is actually how I ended up in Texas, is I was hired as a postdoc on this project and only planned to be here for a few years, but it was so amazing and interesting. And I loved working at the Wildflower Center that, you know, now I'm here probably permanently. But this project was started in 2017 by a group of researchers, including Dr. Shalini Jha at UT Austin, Eleanor Lichtenberg at UNT, and Kristen Baum at Oklahoma State. And the motivation behind it was that a panel of experts years ago helped the Texas Parks and Wildlife develop a management guide to restoring pollinators in Texas. And it discussed managing grazing, so reducing grazing pressure, conducting prescribed burns where possible, and mowing where burning isn't possible, and then doing a number of range enhancements, reseeding with native plants, so using at least 9 species. But honestly, these techniques are very costly in terms of, you know, money, personnel, time, and materials. And so the recommendations need to be tested across actual working landscapes to make sure that they actually work, because they were based on the opinions of experts rather than actually testing them. And also needs to be tested in places and at times in spatial scales that are relevant to real landscapes. So large spatial scales and monitored for many years. So, so at that time, they created 4 different treatments at a number of sites. Prescribed burns in areas 50 acres and 5 acres in size, And then a prescribed burn that was 5 acres and seeded with target plant species, so with 9 species of flowering plants, and then an untreated control. And this is an example of one of our sites, I'll skip to it. But we have 10 different sites, or at that point we had 10 different sites across the Cross Timbers ecoregion of north central Texas. So ranging all the way from Austin up into Oklahoma. And since then, we've lost some sites and we've added a number of others. But at each of these sites, we conducted our prescribed burns, as well as supplemental seeding. So massive restoration efforts. And one of the key aspects of this project is that we're doing all this work, again, across working landscapes. So we worked with private landowners, the Army Corps, Fish and Wildlife, and state land to enact this in real degraded areas. And then we went back and monitored 3 times a year over the past 6 years. So this is a picture of one of our typical sites. It's just a typical ranch in Texas, short grass, number of forbs, and it has in the past been heavily grazed. And this is kind of typical of what our sites look like even post-seeding. So there are flowers, but it's generally not super high abundance just because these are very harsh conditions.
What's a forb?
Oh, sorry, flowering plant. Yeah, so there's grasses, and then all the flowers are. Then we also have sites like this. In some of our years, I think this was from 2 years ago when we had good summer rains, we do see some mass flowering. So we then went and collected pollinators, insect pollinators across 4 different groups. So the bees and wasps, beetles, flies, and butterflies. We used a combination of netting for pollinators, standardized netting, and then this standardized method of trapping called pan traps, which are essentially just little colorful bowls. They're either blue, white, or yellow, and they're filled with soapy water. And somehow it's the best technique we have for catching bees. They think that it's flowers and they just fly right in. We also searched for milkweeds and monarch eggs. Okay, so now I want to get into some of the results. So starting with their food and the resources. So asking, how does restoration affect nest sites and food resources for pollinators? So I'll talk you through this graph. I know it can be a little complicated. There are 4 treatments on here for each of our 4 treatments. So 5-acre burn, 50-acre burn, seeding, and controls. And what we're interested in here is the difference between our treatments within a single year, not necessarily the difference between years. Because difference between years is generally due to things like weather, so precipitation, but the difference within a year is due to the actual effects of the treatment. So we did our pre-treatment collection in 2017, and then after that, 2018 through 21, and the study's still going. I just haven't put in the 2 last years yet. All of that's post-treatment, so this is showing 4 years post-treatment. And interestingly, we're actually seeing no change in flower richness. So the number of species, number of flower species in our sites, even after burning, which was a little discouraging. So we did find, however, a difference in the number of seeded species. So we added seeded flowers to one of the treatments. That's this yellow line here. And you would expect to see those seeded species come up. So this was just a test of that. And we find that they do increase, but not quite as strongly as we'd like, but it is significantly different. But partially you can see that the flowers are just very low abundance in general. Okay, so far with the resources, we found that there wasn't a huge change in the floral resources in those the flowers available for pollinators. So then asking the question, how are the pollinators themselves responding? So I only right now have data from 2017 to 2019. We actually were entering bees over the last few days for the other 2 years that we have, but I wasn't able to get them in time. But over just those 3 years, we collected almost 15,000 specimens. So it's a lot of pollinators and 400 pollinator species, which again is incredible. And this is kind of the breakdown of what we were catching. So we caught a lot of flies and bees, which again are the two most important pollinator groups, fewer butterflies and beetles. So interestingly, we went through and we've been looking at how pollinators are responding to different aspects of the environment. One thing that we found is that it doesn't look as clear here as it is, but pollinators are responding, or bees are responding positively to the amount of bare ground. So especially after burns, when that bare ground opens up, see an increase in pollinators in the sites that were burned. And then over time, as that fills in with vegetation again, the number of bees starts decreasing. Interestingly, we found that pollinators, so in 2017, you can see the number of pollinators caught in these plots was relatively similar between treatments. In 2018, we see this kind of interesting difference between treatments. So this is directly after the burning. We find that the control has more pollinators than the burned plots, but that and that the seeded plots have the lowest, likely because of the ground disturbance. But those pollinators recover in just just 2 years following restoration. But we're not seeing an increase in the number of pollinators yet in the first 2 years. So again, a big part of the reason why we don't have all of the data yet is that once we get all those specimens, we have to pin them, identify them, and it ends up taking years to process these data. And so what I did to get an idea of what might be happening for the rest of the pollinators is I pulled out specifically the bumblebees, which is something I could ID really easily and count. And we see that same trend where there's a decrease in the first year after restoration in our treated sites and recovery in the first year. But now by 2021, we're seeing that the seeded plots are starting to show slightly more bumblebees. So it'll be interesting once we add in those other species. But regardless, we're finding that while pollinators recover quickly from our disturbances, we're not seeing increases the way we were hoping to with these restoration actions. So the question is, what's going on here, and why aren't we seeing more of an effect of burning than seeding? We talked to some of our landowners, they gave us all this land set aside, and they were expecting to see it totally full of pollinators. And you see that in some of the plots, but not all of them. So what's going on? Well, to start answering this question, we have to turn to a study that's been going for much, much longer. So this is our land management study at the Wildflower Center. And this is one of our largest studies. So this study asks two overarching questions. How does the management that we're doing, so going back to those burning and mowing questions, how does that achieve our ecological objectives, and how can we improve our methods? So I said at the beginning that historically most fires in Texas would have happened in the summer, caused by lightning strikes, and these fires would have been hot and fast. So they move across the landscape really rapidly if it's a grass fire. And they generally just take off that top layer. Sometimes they don't even penetrate far down into the soil. However, the burns that happen these days more often in prescribed burns happen in the winter. This is generally because they can be a bit easier to control, though that's actually debatable, but there's the perception that they can be easier to control. And they also can be used to increase forage for cattle. So this is what is used across a lot of ranch land. But the question is, what is the ecological difference between these two? And I'm going to preface all this by saying that in the last study I was just talking about, we did all of our burns in the winter. So here's the Wildflower Center again, just to give you an idea of the map. So this is our research area down here. And this study that was started in 2001 is over 70 acres. So a large part of the Wildflower Center. So you can see all of our gardens up here. This is so much bigger than the gardens and has been going for 23 years at this point. We have 9 different treatments and 54 plots, and we conduct management every 3 to 5 years. And the purpose of this study is to understand how burns that are done at different times of the year affect the outcomes compared to areas that aren't burned at all. And also, we have mowing treatments to understand whether mowing can be used as a substitute for burning. So really massive study. This is the main research arm of the Wildflower Center. And so, so this was started in 2001. And since then, we have teams of volunteers that go out, volunteers and experts. So our whole department and a lot of folks at the Wildflower Center do this every year, but also large teams of volunteers, often dozens, go out and we identify plants across these permanent transects. We identify everything within these areas and calculate their cover. So we get an estimate of their abundance and all the species. So this is a massive effort. We found about 300 plant species, which is relatively low actually for Texas, which is because of the history of grazing at the Wildflower Center. But we've made about 300,000 plant observations. So this is an incredibly powerful data set to understand how plants change over time. So using this data set, we're able to ask a ton of questions about how climate is affecting specific species or communities of plants, and also how our treatments are affecting them. So want to start by showing this graph of the number of plant species over time across 3 different treatments. So again, we had 9 different treatments, but in this first pass, we were most interested in comparing the different seasons of burns. And keep in mind, remember again, that our restoration treatments were done in the winter. But we're finding that the number of plant species that we find across our sites is lowest in these areas that are burned in the winter, even lower than in control sites, which aren't burned at all. And actually, you see this really strong, clear increase in the number of species in summer burned areas over time. And at the Wildflower Center, it's actually fascinating to walk around our plots because it's been long enough and the effects are strong enough that you can see, we have the plots side by side, you can see the plant communities look totally different. So going back to the forbs, which is the flowering plants, so all of our little flowers, which of course are the resources for pollinators, we see the same strong trend. So higher numbers of these flowering plants in the summer burned plots, And you'll also notice that it takes years of management. So we started these treatments in 2001, so immediately, and then started collecting data. There was no pre-treatment time. And you can see that there's very little difference between the treatments at that time. But by 20 years down the road, you start seeing these massive changes in the number of flowers. So something that we think is driving this at the Wildflower Center is the King Ranch blue stem. So are any of you familiar with King Ranch?
Oh, yes.
Probably everybody. It's the scourge of all of us ecologists. So King Ranch blue stem is one of our worst invasive grasses. And it was actually spread throughout Texas and a lot of the Midwest during the Dust Bowl to aid with erosion. And it's really good at that. But it is, it creates these strong mats where it grows and then it dies and it grows and it dies and ends up creating this monoculture that's basically just King Ranch blue stem. And we find that the number of species here on the x-axis or the y-axis, number of species goes down as the proportion of these non-native grasses increases. And so we also find that the winter burns have much more of this invasive grass than the summer burns or even the controls. So showing the proportion cover by time, and you can see that the summer burn kind of hovers at this low, lower proportion, where the amount of King Ranch blue stem in the winter burn just kind of skyrockets. And again, this effect can take years, but we see some signature of it almost immediately. So in summary, we find that burns across different seasons have different effects on things like biomass and plant diversity, but that the full effects of all of these treatments are only really seen after years of burning. So plant species also react to burning differently based on taxonomic group and life histories. So what this means for our other study is that one, we may have done the burn in the wrong season. And two, you only start seeing these strong effects after many years of burning. Once you start breaking it down, it takes at least 2 burns to start seeing those effects. And so with that in mind, this year, we're actually gearing up now to reburn all of these sites in the late summer, so August and September. And I just wanted to show one other thing, because I mentioned that we have 9 different treatments. So I did put many results of the mowing treatments because it can get complicated fast. But I didn't label this graph either. But this is the proportion cover of flower species most used by bees and other pollinators, according to our database. And you can see the same trend where, and this is a terrible color scheme. I don't know what I was thinking. So, but you can see, you know, this is what I was showing you before. This is some of the, or at least it's similar. Flowering plants are higher in the summer burns than these other burn treatments. But when you add in the mowing treatments, interestingly, you start seeing even more flowering plants than in the burns. And that's really fascinating because we don't see that reflected in our overall diversity, because if we do the mowing, we start losing a lot of our grass species and a lot of our smaller, less important for pollinators, flowering plants, but we do see it for some of these showier things that pollinators rely on. And we find that the best time to mow is in the summer or the fall, likely because that also controls that King Ranch blue stem. So this is I wanted to throw this on here even with the terrible color scheme, just because this can be an important take home for people who live in urban areas who can't necessarily do these big burns or any of these other management methods. So in general, our work has a number of implications for management. It's important to identify the resources necessary to support pollinators. So it's not necessarily just the whole flower community, but it can also be things like nesting resources, bare ground. A bummer for us, but it can take years to see results. And we need more long-term monitoring to assess the success. So I have this what you can do section. I'll go through it quickly because as Audubon folks, I think you largely know what to do, but just some items for us to talk about later. So one thing, we talk to a lot of landowners across Texas that own these big ranches. And so we recommend that people engage in small scale restoration wherever they can. Consider burning or mowing, removing invasive plants, and even seeding. And I've seen this in a lot of my work in other places in Illinois, especially. There's starting to be a culture of people thinking that restoration is cool. Like they'll put it on the edge of their fields or near their, the front of their house. And it's something they like to talk about with their neighbors, but I haven't seen the same shift in culture here in Texas yet. And so it's something that I'm very interested in, is actually changing that culture and getting it to a point where people are talking about all the full plant species that they're growing. So part of that is planting native plants. So for people that live in more urban areas, you can do this in your garden. Planting native plants, they're adapted to local pollinators and other beneficial insects, so they often provide more resources. They're also adapted to local weather, pests, and weeds, so they require less management, and important right now, they often require less water. Plant a high diversity of flowers, and this is really important because there are a lot of specialist pollinators in Texas. So you'll only get certain species with certain flowers and types of flowers. And it also, in Texas, it's important to have high diversity because we have 2 peaks in our flowering or in our bloom timing. So we don't just have a peak in the summer, we have one in the spring and one in the fall. So you want resources for the different communities of bees because there are very different communities across those 2 different seasons. Providing pollinator nesting areas can be important, especially in more urban areas. And then finally, I just wanted to give a plug for the Xerces Society, which many of you are probably familiar with, but it is a nonprofit dedicated to conservation. And I love them because they have tons of books and resources online for doing your own habitat restorations, own plantings in your gardens, specifically for pollinators and for building bee hotels and all sorts of things. And then finally, there is a lot of community science. There are many different projects. So one that I really like is Bumblebee Watch, which is very similar to iNaturalist. You take a picture of a bumblebee and you upload it, but it's focused just on bumblebees, and it's all the bees are checked by experts. And so it can be used to see movement and changes in populations over time. And I think this is really important in Texas because our most common bee here is the American bumblebee, which has been declining really rapidly in other parts of the states. So in the Midwest, it's actually becoming relatively rare. And even though it still feels like it's one of the most common ones that we have, there is a lot of evidence that it's declining here too. I think you're all familiar with iNaturalist. I think that's also really important for the same reasons. And then this project called the Great Sunflower Project, which is a community science project where people can go out, set up a space where they watch and count pollinators and then upload it. So it's a way to track and that's all I had. So I'm ready to take questions.
A graph there that showed that bees, including wasps, were almost as good as flies or vice versa. I don't see many bees, but I've got, a bunch of yellow jackets.
Yeah.
How good are wasps in general and yellow jackets particularly as far as pollination?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Flies are actually very good pollinators, but wasps are not. It's because the reason why bees are such good pollinators is because they have modified hairs for holding on to pollen. And they're just hairy in general, but on wasps, it just falls off. So they're not great pollinators. There are some that do more than others, but they're not as good as bees, unfortunately. Yeah.
Where is the Xerxes group based? Are they?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think they're on the West Coast somewhere.
California?
But interestingly, they have offices all over the country, but we don't have any in Texas. And so we have a volunteer, some group, or a very small volunteer group that works as Xerxes. But it's kind of amazing to me that we don't have that. Yeah.
I'm curious, what is the impact of soil on your studies? And what was the initial soil condition taken into account in your studies? Because in Texas we have severely degraded soils all throughout Texas because of overgrazing, 1,000 other reasons.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to know how that would impact your studies.
Yeah, I'm also curious about it. We've looked in our models, we've included that, and we haven't found any of that. But I think that we're really careful with study design to within a single site position plots in the same soils, and so that means that we actually try to standardize for that. So there's differences between sites, but we can't separate that from latitude. So that's not something that we can really separate out right now. But we actually have been talking about that because I think it probably has a huge impact on the nest. And the plant community itself has a huge impact on the soil. And so we've talked about studies that we could do at the Wildflower Center, because part of the issue is that we're working across such a huge geographic range. Other study, that's one of the strengths of it, but also it can be a weakness. So we're now talking about adding pollinator component, or a pollinator component, looking at bees specifically across this long-term study where we have small scale differences in soil. And we found that there's really large differences in compaction due to our different treatments. So by measuring bees in different areas and testing, how many emerge in the spring, we can start to get that. But it's tricky.
I noticed that some of where your plots are and everything, you didn't come closer to San Antonio in this part of the hill country. You stayed further
We were in the cross timbers, and a lot of that is historical, unfortunately, or not historical. It's due to funding. So we had funding to do a multi-state project. So we picked an eco-region, cross timbers, which was in both Texas and Oklahoma. But now we're no longer on that funding. So we're just continuing the project where it's been established. But that is part of this year. We established 3 new sites in a similar geographic range. But one of my dreams is because we use this as an outreach arm of the Wildflower Center to actually reach into communities and show them some of these burning practices, and they can be safe and how we do everything. So part of my dream is actually making it in the hill country as well and having a parallel, maybe smaller scale study. And so we've been talking with some folks, city of Austin, especially about adding sites around there, but we've also been thinking about San Antonio.
Do you have any questions for the
Yes,
chat?
I do. Okay. Can you recommend a good document or website to offer guidance on seeding methods on lands from 1 to 20 acres in size?
Think about that. So I think that you would have to break that down. One is going to be the seed mix. And for the seed mix, I think you can find information on Xerces. And I recommend there's a few groups in Texas that offer native seed, but we usually work with Native American seed. The good,
In Junction, Texas.
I don't even remember where it is. Not sure. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it is.
Yeah, so the center works with them a lot, but in terms of seeding methods, I can't think of, I don't know off the top of my head.
Why are beetles considered good pollinators? How do they carry pollen?
Yeah, so what we included in our study was the major groups that visited flowers. So not necessarily pollinators, but flower visitors. But beetles actually are relatively good at carrying pollen. A lot of the ones that visit flowers have the same adaptations bees do. So you can see that a lot of them are very hairy. And different pollinators have been shown to have, because of their behavior, different effects on pollination. So bees are very good at pollen or transferring pollen short distances, but a lot of pollen. But things like flies and beetles, because they don't have a central nest that they go back to, are better at transferring smaller amounts of pollen over long distances.
Can we have another one? We do one here. Okay, Kim.
So I kind of looked for information on your big project that you're doing around the center. Like I couldn't find much information on actual results and data on your website. Have you published in any journals up at this point?
No, not yet. So that is something we're working on right now. So we have 3 papers. This study, that is also historical. So the study was set up 20 years ago by a researcher at the Wildflower Center who actually tragically passed away. And people at the center kept collecting the data without a plan to disseminate the information. And so our science and conservation team is relatively new. And so we have now been gathering all the data, fixing it up, and hopefully preparing to release it soon. So we're going to be publishing in academic journals, but what we really are excited about doing is we have a breakdown of every individual species and how they respond over time and to different treatments. And we are planning to release all of that onto the website into a giant document for nerds that can just go down and look at the exact species that you want. And then do the management for that community. And so if there are specific species you have in mind, we already have that information, so we can just connect on that before publication.
Chat? Yes. We examined the potential impact of larval plant diversity on pollinator species other than.
Yeah, so my interest, just transparently, is bees. So I spend most of my time thinking about bees. A big component of the study that we haven't started digging into yet is milkweeds and monarchs. So there was this whole big part of the project I didn't talk about where we do searches for milkweeds along transects and then also searching the entire site essentially for them. And then we look for monarch eggs and then we would do monarch counts. But we have not analyzed those data yet.
Somebody asked, so what about fly traps? Good or bad? Question mark.
Fly traps.
there like tags that you can hang outside that have?
Stick bags.
Yes, they
Oh,
will,
yeah.
because should you kill flies, since you say flies are good pollinators?
No, so different species of flies do different things. So a lot of the carrion flies or a lot of the whiting flies are not going to be good pollinators. The ones that we mostly care about are the flower flies or the bee flies. They often look like bees and they have very similar adaptations to bees. So a lot of people don't expect this from flies, but a lot of there are fly species, even here in Texas, that have hairs on their legs like bees do. Robber flies, they do, but they're not necessarily eating the pollen. But they are very hairy and they go to flowers. But there are flies that actually have those adaptations just for eating pollen, and they exhibit a lot of the same behaviors as bees. But those things, those are not the flies that are biting you. So.
Like house flies are not good pollinators.
No, house flies are not good pollinators, or your flies are good pollinators. So I say, kill all the flies.
And wasps.
That's a
Any more on the chat?
Yeah.
We have time for-
wasps are not good pollinators, but they're really good predators. And they, yeah, so don't kill wasps.
The different pollinators detected with the same efficiency.
That is an interesting question. So that's part of why we use both the netting and pan trapping. Different pollinators go to, like, some you catch better with netting, some go to traps more easily. But it is all biased, and so you just try to standardize your method across all of your sites, understanding that it's biased. And so we're definitely missing some groups of pollinators, but we try to catch as many as we can. But that's something that's actually still kind of hotly debated in the pollinator research sphere, how to do that and how to remove that bias.
The area that you're doing the birds, they get the wildflower center, you don't water it, that's all.
It's totally natural, yes, just looking at recovery over time. It's a fascinating area because it was very heavily grazed for many years and was only released from grazing, I think, about 50 years ago. And so it is still changing and very dynamic. And so when we look at all these different metrics and all the different species, they're still changing over time. We still see stuff popping up from the seed bank that we don't expect.
We're talking about the bumblebees nest in the ground, and you're talking about bare plots. So if we have our native plants in our house, should we leave total bare dirt and not plant wildflower seeds?
No, so what I recommend doing is planting species of plants to, you don't necessarily want it all to be exposed to the heat, especially here in Texas. Generally, you want plants that are more sparse and have bare ground around them. So not exclusively plants that fill all of that in and shade everything. And so sometimes I recommend putting in like bunch grasses or something to space in between them. I think a good model is to think about what a historic prairie would have looked like. There would have been big gaps between a lot of the plants. And the problems that we run into now with like King Ranch bluestem is that it's covering everything. Yeah.
That's right, and then also, it also helps native sparrows. Because if you're that big, like Stuart Little, the little mouse, and you're trying to get through that, you can't get through it. And so it increases the diversity of native sparrows if you have that bare spots between.
Going back to the compaction question, one really cool thing I've seen in some gardens is called a bee spiral, where I think that, people will grow herbs and this kind of thing, but it's a spiral that goes around, so you have higher elevation of one part than the other. And so there's different amounts of drainage, and then you plant sparse plants up it. And evidently you'll get different bee species depending on compaction and type of soil as things move along.
Well, thank you. We have one more announcement before you all get up, and want to thank you very much for coming up.
If you all have any more questions about this stuff, we are actually totally happy to answer them, and we have someone on our staff at the Wildflower Center that answers questions about plants. So you can always just reach out to us. My contact information is on the website, and you can also probably get it from these folks.
So if you're driving home tonight, you thought, oh, I wish I'd have asked such and so, you'd have a resource. And what the Wildflower Center is a wonderful resource. And we want to make an announcement tonight. We have a native plant nursery opening September 1st. It's called Pollinators. What a great name. And this gentleman right here is the, what would you say, the sheep pollinated? Could you tell us where?
I'm number 2.
Oh, your wife is number 1. I get it. Okay. I get it.
51% of the company.
So where are you? And when can we expect to be there and find these plants?
The nursery is in Converse, so we're just inside of 1604, a little bit south of 35. We'll be open, grand opening September the 1st. That's a Friday at 9 o'clock, and then we'll be open Wednesday through Sunday after that, 9 to 6.
9 to 6. Okay, and you have a wonderful website, so you can find
Facebook, Instagram,
Okay,
or pollinators.com.
Pollinators. It's easy to remember. And so there's your source right there, and a source of good information too. So any other last questions or? Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing about these critters. The bees, and you've probably heard about the birds and the bees at some point in your life, and they're both important, and we can't have one without the other. So, and the plants are the base of it all, and we got to learn about these things. So thank you so much for coming, and don't forget, next month, we're going to have a big, well, maybe a small celebration, but a celebration, and we're going to have a wonderful speaker, and want you to come back. So stay cool, stay hydrated, and get your duck stamps. So if anybody would like to have one, we do have them over here. Okay, thank you. Night, night.